Welcome to another episode of Open World Chat. I'm your host, John Odom. Jim Dandino is here, as always, or at least as mostly always.
Sometimes.
And sometimes always, semi-always. And we are going to be talking today to Andrew Liptak, the author of Cosplay, A History, the builders, fans, and makers who bring your favorite stories to life. Andrew, thank you for being here. We're very excited to chat with you.
Thank you. And Barry resident.
A Barry resident, right? We're keeping it all Vermont here, by God.
I used to run a website called Geek Mountain State, and it was very much focused on all the geek things that happened in Vermont. And it's nice to at least add to that canon a little bit.
Oh, no way. That's so cool. Oh, I'm going to have to go dig.
You know, between you were the IO9 weekend editor for a while too, right?
I was.
Yeah, and you know, you're a Vermonter, you were a nerd blogger for some time, and now you are a published author. This is very much a local boy makes good kind of situation for us. It's like, well, we could be him when we grow up someday. Tell us how the reception to the book has been. It seems like from what I've seen, people are thrilled to have it and excited to read it.
I think so. Is the video on this, or is it just audio?
No video.
Okay, so I can wave the book around and nobody will see.
You can wave it. You can describe it in using visual.
It is half a cat killer. It's a very hefty coffee table type book. It has a big C on the cover with some pictures on it, and it's my attempt to sort of look at the beginning to end story of what cosplay is and where it came from and where it's headed, and about everything in between. It's not. I'm a little bit reluctant to call it a definitive history of cosplay because just as a historian, there's no way to ever get a definitive history of anything because there's just so many stories. And even while writing the book, after I finished and turned the book in, I was still turning over rocks and finding new stories to add to it. And that's been an interesting process. But hopefully, it's somewhat comprehensive, or at least somewhat full. And it was a fun journey to work on.
Where did the inspiration for the book come from? Is it because you're a 501st guy?
Yeah, originally what happened, so this goes back a little bit. So I had written for, as I said, sites like IO9 and SF Signal, Kirkus Reviews, and I've been reviewing and reading books for a long time, and I knew some editors who had been working, the editor at Saga Press. I had reviewed some of the books that he had worked on, and we knew each other a little bit through the science fiction world. And he reached out to me and basically said, like, hey, I was at San Diego Comic-Con, and I came across this really interesting story. And he recounted the story of how there was a 501st member who had walked 501 miles from Northern California to San Diego, as sort of like a, and there's dog right on time. This 501st member had walked 501 miles to San Diego Comic-Con. His wife had died of cancer, and it was to raise awareness for that. And he's this is a really interesting story. It's and the guy walked in armor, and this was as a stormtrooper. And it takes a lot of dedication. And so he wanted to sort of see, like, is there a story here? And so that was sort of the starting point. Put together an outline, tried to work that version through the publishing world, and it didn't quite work. But then when I got a new agent, we retooled it. Because as I had been putting this thing together, I realized that, I had put in a chapter about the history of where cosplay had come from to put everything in context, and realized that, there's a lot more to it than just a chapter's worth. And it basically just grew and grew. And basically, so I basically went and retooled it and had basically an early version of what this book was. And obviously it changes a little bit from pitch to final product. And so, that's basically where it came from, is just the wanting to sort of document, where did cosplay come from, but like, what is the intersection between that and science fiction fan culture, the deeper history of why why we dress up in costume. What else? There's a whole lot of other things just shoved in there, just because it's a very interconnected field. So I wanted to make sure we covered reenacting, like military reenacting, like the Civil War folks and the Revolutionary War folks, but also things like the 501st, and then the technology stories. Like how does changing technologies alter the way we cosplay and the way we come to this, not just in like 3D printer, not just with 3D printers, but with like things like social networks and like, how do all these things influence the state of the field today? So that's the roundabout way that all came together.
Well, I have to assume that
really interesting. You sort of track what we think of as cosplay back into the old sci-fi conventions in like the 30s and such.
Even further beyond that. So it's like anything with history. You pull a string and you can always have sort of a starting point, but then there's always something that sort of predates that starting point, and you go to that point and then you find something that goes even earlier. So 1939, there's a World Science Fiction Convention. That's where Forrest Ackerman and Myrtle Douglas showed up in costume. It was the first World Science Fiction Convention. And that's sort of seen as like the first cosplay at a con. And there's earlier examples. There's a little comic called Mr. Skygack from Mars, which was pretty popular in the early 1900s. The Strange World comics, where the alien is making these very literal observations about things, like, oh, I'm going to go get some mild radiation burns, and meaning he's going to go get a suntan. It's a comic that goes sort of going on right now, but it's that's sort of the same tone. It's these very literal. It's basically this little alien with a white smock and a gas mask, making these very literal observations about what people are up to. And so there were people who dressed up as him. And then you go even further back. There was little like sort of proto conventions in England in the late 1800s, and then Jules Verne had a costume party at his house. Arthur Conan Doyle liked dressing up as one of his characters, and there's all these little examples that sort of scattered out throughout the timeline. But then you go even further back, like, so why are we? How did it come to the point where we are dressing up in costumes in the first place? So I traced that back a little bit further. Going back to some of the Greek traditions of theater, and how does that go from sort of these quasi-religious ceremonies to something that where theatrical performers and creators are trying to make things more and more realistic by adding props, adding costumes, adding really detailed sets, and all these things sort of come up to the modern day, normalizing the idea of costumes as a form of entertainment, as a form of play. And then you get up to the 1930s, and then from there you have science fiction conventions and people gathering up for those.
So I'm fascinated with the cultural questions, with the culture of cosplay. And Jim and I talk about comics, movies. We talk to some folks who work behind the scenes. It's taken us a while to get to cosplay, honestly. And I wonder do you think the cosplay culture gets the respect it deserves from sort of other parts of the geekosphere?
Yes and no. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One of the things that I tried to explore in the book is how cosplay has become more of a mainstream thing. And from the 30s to late 2000s, it was very much a niche thing. Again, looking at it from a mainstream non-genre perspective, it was sort of seen as like the weird thing that people would do on the weekends, or like the nerds who lived in their parents' basements would do. And I know with growing up in the 501st, there was a lot of sort of resentment towards me, local newscasts and whatnot, because they would be very dismissive, and they would be very like, oh, these people need to get a life. They're not doing anything worthwhile while we are raising money for like toy drives or some sort of charitable organization. So there was that element to it. But even within the science fiction fantasy world, cosplay was always sort of shunted off into this corner. It was at the first conventions, but how it sort of evolved is that it was sort of became this. It was called a masquerade, and it was basically a fixture in the con sort of towards the end, where you would dress up and it would basically be like a costume contest. That's basically what it is. And there's a hierarchical point system and classification and tiers, and it became more sophisticated as time goes on. But talking to some of the old time science fiction fans, like they were like, no, you wouldn't really wear your costumes outside of those periods. And it wasn't until like the 1960s, 70s that you start to wear you'd see people wearing costumes on the floor, going to panels or just sort of hanging out. And these are not the types of cons like San Diego Comic-Con, where you are, you have cosplay everywhere, or it's basically, giant nerd flea market. These are basically like seminars where you'd have, panel discussions about books or movies, TV shows, or themes and genres, things like that. So you have this reluctance, or this sort of cultural, trying to find the right word for it, sort of like, I don't want to say dismissiveness, but like, you don't do that here. Like there's a time and a place for the costumes, and you do that here. 1960s, that starts to change because Star Trek comes out. And my theory here is that, well, you have a lot of new fans coming into science fiction fandom. These are people who did not grow up in the literary tradition. They didn't, they weren't just reading the books or putting together monographed zines for one another. They were watching Star Trek on TV, and they would come in and they would just, they had their own way of doing things. They also were responsible for fan fiction, and Star Trek costumes are also a lot more comfortable to wear. You can just throw on the tunic and the pants, and it's regular clothing. Whereas like some other science fiction costumes at the time were a lot more elaborate, and they were more time consuming to put on, sort of like putting on a stormtrooper right now, like at a con right now. It takes time and effort to do that, whereas on my off, if I'm not wearing that, I'll probably throw on a jumpsuit of something else because it's more comfortable. So 1960s, 1970s, that sort of starts to change, and that's sort of where you see this sort of schism in fandom. You've got people who are still somewhat dismissive of it these days, but it's less of a thing. And people who are more media focused in science fiction fandom, they're dedicated Star Wars fans, dedicated Star Trek fans, or Doctor Who fans, and they form their own spaces, their own conventions and whatnot. So that's sort of where you see these splits happen is within fandom at that time. And nowadays it's become much more common. And as I said, you do see some people who are sort of dismissive of it. I don't know. It's not something I really take a whole lot of stock in because, I'm a cosplayer myself. But the types of cons that I go to as a stormtrooper or, in other costume are not quite the same that I would go to as a science fiction fan. Like when I went to ReaderCon, I wouldn't necessarily I was actually told I shouldn't bring my stormtrooper to that. But there's other cons that I might bring it out to, like the Vermont Sci-Fi Fantasy Expo and things like that. So
I'm wondering, you mentioned that it kind of took off with Star Trek. Is that right?
That element of it, but yeah, like Star Trek, certainly it what it did is it sort of brought about a bit of a cultural change, I think, for science fiction fandom, in that it introduced the idea that you can be a fan of these types of works in different ways, not necessarily just books or literature. You could be fans of the TV shows, and with that, I think came a little bit more willingness, of people to dress up in costume. And I think there's also a generational change to it. A lot of the really old time sci-fi fans, or as I would say, SF fans, they were not. I don't think I've ever seen a TV show or movie that they've ever been thrilled with. I saw somebody even just this year going like, "Oh, Dune won the Hugo Award. What are you talking about?" And I think Star Trek and Star Wars sort of had those same attitudes at the time, like that, they're hugely influential works, but like they're not, people would nitpick, the accuracy or the types of stories or whatnot. But I think that as you bring in younger folks who are growing up with those types of stories, you're going to have those people embrace them a little bit in different ways.
Well, I'm wondering also if the provision of some visual standards helped encourage cosplay's flourishing, right? Because like there are descriptions of what John Carter, Warlord of Mars, is supposed to look like in the books. There are descriptions of what Captain Nemo looks like in the books, but everybody's going to read that differently, right? But when you get Captain Kirk on screen, when you get Uhura on screen, you have a standard to aspire to when you're designing that sort of thing. And I'm wondering if that didn't contribute to a rise in popularity of the form.
Oh, I'm sure. Because you would have book covers and you would have like comics and I'm trying to think of what else, probably, fan art and things like that. And, and the descriptions. You would, I think that definitely gives people it's one of those things that sort of eases the path a little bit. And there's a lot of different barriers to this sort of thing. So before 1966, you don't have, let's say you don't really have screen accuracy isn't really a thing until you have screens. But having a visual guide for what those for what those shows look like and what those costumes look like and see them actually on a person, as a garment that has been put together, physically put together and worn, that is something that really does help speed the way, because you can replicate that. If you have, if you're good with a sewing machine or, developing your own patterns, you can say, all right, I can deconstruct this and retrofit it backwards. Or there's other barriers along the way. Like one of the big ones that I was surprised at was the fidelity of the film. So like when you get I'm trying to think of what it was. So there's a guy I talked to for the book. He made a really cool stormtrooper outfit in the 1970s, and out of cardboard, paper mache, football helmet, that sort of thing. He had to go to see Star Wars 20, 30 times to get all the details right, because the only pictures he had available to him were in fairly grainy ones in magazines. Fast forward a couple of years, you've got VHS players. You can do that from home. You can rewind, you can pause, but you still have the lines, and it's not that great. And then the DVD comes along, and hey, you can stop it right exactly where you want it. You can go frame by frame if you want to. And then you have Blu-ray come by. And with the Blu-ray disc, this was kind of the fun thing I learned, is that the Boba Fett costumers out there had been, for years looking at those costumes on screen, and they could tell that, hey, there's something on his arms, and there's other little really fine details on the bits of armor, but they could never really tell what they were, because the resolution wasn't great. The Blu-rays come by, they figure out, oh, that's a calculator, and we know exactly what type of calculator it is. So they go out and find those pieces and are able to implement them into their costumes and make them even more accurate. So there's all these little things that sort of stand in the way, once you sort of remove those barriers. And then, that goes to production as well. If you use EVA foam, or if you use a 3D printer, those are cheaper ways than making it in other conventional ways, like making a mold or stamping metal or whatnot.
Do you find that that the pace of information sharing speeding up the way that it has led to homogeneity, or whatever? I don't know. Is it kind of streamlining everybody's costumes? Is it reducing individuality?
Yes and no. So there's a couple of interesting things that have happened. One of the ththings that I spoke, there's a guy named Art Andrews who I talked to. He owns a site called the Replica Props Forum, which has been around since the 1990s. And one of the things that he's noticed is that you have these cycles of costumes that come up, and every year you find like sort of the popular ones that are coming out, and then it dies off because that TV show is no longer the next new thing. This year's big costume was Steve from Stranger Things. Harley Quinn has been a popular one. The Broken Hobo Spider-Man from Into the Spider-Verse was one. And so you have costumes that will sort of become really popular for a year, and then, or that con season, and then they'll die off because everyone sort of moves on to the next thing. I think in some ways that is part of just sort of the cyclical nature of the tempo of the entertainment industry. You're always getting new films, whereas 1980s, 1990s, you didn't have, I don't know how many like superhero films come out every year, or science fiction films. There is it's a fire hose right now, and I think in some ways that's it's unfortunate because you don't see people spending this incredible amount of time. Like I know people who have spent like a decade, thousands of dollars to make the perfect Boba Fett, and you don't really see that with some of the newer costumes. You might see people who are they're, because they can build it very quickly. They can put together something that is quite good, but then sort of not when the interest dies off, they sort of move on to other things. And I think there's an unfortunate element to that, because I don't think that pop culture should be disposable. And I don't think that I think this, the reason that we come back to these stories is because they stick with us. The other thing with the fire hose is that, you do have lots of people who will, there's a lot more variety than there was before. So you have people who can, sort of do like the really easy costumes, like the Steve from, is it Steve? No, it's not Steve from Stranger Things. Eddie.
Eddie Munson, yeah.
So yeah, he was the really popular one. And actually, Steve, last like a couple years ago when Stranger Things 3 came out, Steve was a really popular one because people went out and bought the ice cream shop outfits. So there is there is a lot of variety out there for what people could what people can do. You've got no shortage of animation things, you've got no shortage of Marvel, you've got no shortage of Star Wars comics, you name it. So I think that there's good variety. I do think people will gravitate towards what is fairly easy to put together, unless they're really looking for a really challenging thing. But the reason I think you see a lot of Eddie Munson's is because it's a really easy costume to put together, or the hobo Spider-Man, because I put one of those together because I had a trench coat, I was able to get a Spider-Man top, sweatpants, 2 mismatched sneakers, mess up my hair and not shave for a day, and I looked just fine. So I don't know that there's really a lot of homogeneity to it, but there is. Or I'm just seems like
the disposability. I think disposability is a good way of putting it, because you've got folks like you, the 501st that are dedicated to it, that are passionate about it, but then you've got the kids that wander. You've got the people. I mean, everybody's a kid to me. I'm an old man now, but you've got the kids that wander through the cons dressed in whatever the latest fad is. And
yeah,
you're right. I mean, I was the first. I went to the first New York Comic Con ever. Went to the first 10 years of it. Watched the cycles, but also watched the pros who were like passionate and dedicated, and they were the ones that are. They seem like the ones that are kind of holding on to the old ways and holding on to the old stories.
Yeah,
more.
And I mean, that's not to say that anybody's experience is not valid if they want to do the easier costumes. Like cosplay is what you make of it, and this is an incredibly personal thing. If you like those characters, if you are really attached to them, by all means go do them. And to be sure, like there is no shortage of new costumes ever coming out. So I'm not faulting people for going from jumping from new one to new one. But like what I do, it is delightful to see stuff that I think most of my complaint here is just that is folks who are trying to just basically just do it because it is popular, because that is this, and I see this a lot in sort of the Instagram scene, where people are basically making costumes because they know that is what will attract a following that'll help them build, it'll help them build their follower base or subscribers or whatever. And that I don't think sits as well with me. I think that it's Yeah, I think it's a really personal thing for each person, and I think that it's my take on cosplay is it's really we're doing this out of the love of story, and I think that if you're just sort of picking up a character and then tossing away, picking him up, tossing away, that's where it's not as I don't know, maybe not as genuine, but again, everyone's mileage varies.
That's influencer culture, though, right? Like, and that's prevalent everywhere, right? It's quite honestly, it's no different than movie directors turning their unused scripts into comic books, right? There is something a little bit distasteful about people treating your favorite medium like a tourist, right?
Yeah, I think that's like probably a good way to put it.
To make money.
I think that's a good way to put it. And, to some extent it comes off, I mean, for me, when I make these arguments, it sort of comes off as like, I was a fan of this before, or name all the albums, that sort of thing, which, I think is also sort of cringeworthy in and of itself. But, I do think that there is, this is sort of just how groups work, is you have people who are dedicated to them and that they really want to, they want to make sure that, people are like have the same level of enthusiasm, I guess. And I'm not casting judgments on folks who are engaged in this and in it, or at least I'm trying not to I try not to judge people for it. But I do think that there is I think it's at its core, cosplay is a really personal thing. And I think that people just should be true to themselves and not basically kill themselves on, trying to chase trends on Instagram or as an influencer culture thing. I think that's more of what more of what sort of bothers me is just like the pace and the grind that that sort of lifestyle or that sort of I don't know, mindset maybe is the best word for it, will take you. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask a question that goes off in a completely different direction, and it's a tricky question to ask. In the sense of here we are, three guys talking about this, but I remember several years back, the first year at New York Comic Con, when the cosplay is not consent signs started popping up. Yep. How much problem in the greater world of cons has sexual harassment been for women cosplayers?
Enormous problem. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One is that sort of for a long time, science fiction culture has incubated this mentality that, you can be awful to women, or you can, especially around cosplayers, like you can touch them without consent, or you can, harass them or even assault them. And I've heard a lot of stories of people who have been harassed and attacked and touched, and it's horrible. And there's
actually
a good reason
assaulted for this.
Oh yeah, I mean, people have been attacked and raped and things at conventions. So you hear all sorts of stories about this. And there's a reason why these movements like Cosplay Isn't Consent and other similar movements pop up, is because there's a problem and that they're reacting to. And my sense is that it's somewhat gotten better. It's still an issue. I mean, you certainly hear about people who get attacked or touched or just have people saying unpleasant things to them. And even online, the anonymity of the internet, it lets lets people do things like that with a lot less consequence than if you're showing up to an event in person. So it's migrated online as well. And there's people I talked to in the book who have talked about the racism that they've faced and whatnot. And it's just horrible to see. On the other hand, there's cosplay can also really do wonders for you if you are. There's a friend of mine who is non-binary, and they were saying that they found refuge in the Mandalorian mercs because of what the armor let you it let them present as they wanted to be seen. So that was sort of that was a big help for them as well. And I think that in some cases people draw on superheroes as very empowering figures. So that's like one reason why they are really attracted to them. And unfortunately, people will because of just the nature of the the nature of how, characters are drawn or conceived of, that's, people sort of don't think of them as people, I think. And, it lets them, do bad things.
That's got to be,
I don't know if that really
you're putting yourself out. Oh, it does. Totally. And I just think about how you talk about what how personal this is. And it is very sort of personal liberating to put on a costume and go out into public and go to a con. You want people to look at you. You're proud of how you look, and you might not necessarily be otherwise. And so that just makes, harassment, assaults in that context seem that much more tragic.
Tragic is a really good word for it, because, you have people who might, just get fed up with the experiences they've had and then leave, leave those, what was really a triumphant thing for them, or, a refuge, or a character that they love, is no longer holding that appeal. And, they might, I know of people who have left the 501st or have left the, cosplay world because of either harassment or just not fitting in with the group. And, it's horrible to see. So,
do you find, did you kind of on the, I guess, following that a little bit, have you found a lot of people from marginalized groups finding a home in the cosplay community because of the way it lets you manipulate your own identity?
Yeah. There's something called 28, is it 28 Black Cosplays in February? 28 Days of Black Cosplays is sort of the movement. And it's basically, it takes place during Black History Month. And, you see a lot of cosplayers boosting one another and sort of uplifting their fellow peers, and basically showing that, we are part of this group. And there are definitely cosplayers who will gravitate, especially if you're from a marginalized community, you might gravitate towards those other cosplayers just because, you have you sort of look like them. You might be drawing from the same pool of characters. Trying to think of the best way to say it. You're finding community within the community. So the cosplay community is enormous. It's full of all sorts of smaller subgroups and whatnot. So I think that, there's definitely people who gravitate towards one another because, they have that shared identity and they have that shared communal background. And that's also just to sort of jump to another point, is that's also not to say that, people who, a Black cosplayer should not be confined to just, other Black characters. You can have a Black Luke Skywalker, you can have a Black Batman or Superman, and there are people who do wonderful versions of those characters, and that sometimes they will get harassed from small-minded people about it. But this is another way, sort of you don't necessarily, cosplay doesn't have to be canon, but it's also how do you see yourself in this world, and how can you put yourself into this world for just a brief moment? If you're a black kid and you like Luke Skywalker, that's the character you look up to, and you can see yourself in them, and I think that's a really powerful thing.
You were talking about some of and this goes back to the beginning here, and you were talking about Civil War reenactments and some of these things that are are those cousins to cosplay? Are they just cosplay in a different form? And where does drag fit into that?
I didn't really explore drag, but the way I see this is that if I was to define cosplay as anything, it's how you are relating to it. How are you using costuming to relate to a story? And you're sort of trying to bring that world to life in some way. So cosplay is sort of the science fiction, fantasy, and your sort of genre fictional version of that. Living history, sort of the academic area of dressing up in costume to sort of relate to a story or to teach a story that is true, and then reenacting is sort of like another sort of subset of that, is where you are, people are really in love with the idea of the story of World War II or of the Civil War or Vietnam. Don't see a lot of Desert Storm reenactors. I'm sure at some point somewhere down the road you'll see some of them. I was surprised when I was doing some research to find Vietnam era cosplayers. Vietnam reenactors. I sort of see that, like, this sort of the idea of just dressing up in costume or uniform as like a big umbrella, and then under that you have, like, sort of these subsets. So, like, if reenacting isn't cosplay, it's a close cousin. So that's why I wanted to include it in the book, is just because, when I was talking to some of the World War II reenactors, like, they're exactly the same as some of my 501st friends. They're talking about how early they got up to get to the event, how much money they had to spend to get their stuff, to get accurate kit. And, just the appreciation and depth of the story that they really wanted to sort of convey to people. So I think, everybody's sort of working towards the same goal, which is to sort of express their appreciation for these stories, whether they're real or fictional. That's basically why I included that in the book.
So, all right, we're probably on the downslope here. We're probably getting close to our end. I want to know what the craziest costume you saw or you've ever seen, including your research for the book, is.
Trying to think. I've seen a lot. It's hard to sort of categorize, because, like, on one hand you have stuff that are really big builds. So somebody doing a Hulkbuster Iron Man, like that, I've seen one of those. That was cool. It towers right above you, and you see the person just sort of plodding along, and it's like, wow, that's the Hulkbuster. I think what's really impressed me most lately, and I haven't seen this in person, but there was somebody on Instagram that I had found that people are always figuring out new ways to do things, and somebody had put together this really elaborate and set of wings that could fold back in on them. And these aren't small things. This is like a 15-foot wingspan that could fold in. I don't remember what costume it was for, but it was just this really impressive.
Simon's an Archangel?
I don't remember. It wasn't the full costume that I saw. It was more somebody who was, I think they were sort of prototyping something, but it was this really just the engineering and the detail that went into it was just astounding, just because, like, wings are hard. Like, if you don't do it right, they're sagging, or they fall off, or they break, because they're delicate just by the way that they're they're constructed. So that was just that just sort of blew me away. It's just like just how people had figured out how to do it, because it takes a lot of ingenuity and a lot of engineering and a lot of patience and prototyping and practice to just sort of put something like that together. So that, I think that was probably one of the more impressive things that I've seen lately. And then you have, like, when you have a good budget behind you, like Adam Savage went he had a TV show recently where he went and had somebody had a whole bunch of schools 3D print with titanium Iron Man armor out of titanium, and basically assembled a complete Iron Man suit and used it to test to see whether or not, is it actually bulletproof, that sort of thing. That was cool. But again, you have a big budget, a TV production budget behind them, and the resources and the name of, the name behind it, that was pretty impressive. So
probably a pretty expensive episode of television either way, though.
And I've actually seen the suit in person, because I went and interviewed him at his cave out in San Francisco, and I think he had it there. I don't remember for sure. I guess another really great one that I would point to is, let's see, what is this? So in 2019, there was a group of kids at a school in New Jersey. They went and they stood up an entire play of the film Alien, and they made all their stuff out of garbage, just stuff they had lying around, zero budget, and they made some of the most amazing spacesuits and amazing costumes that I've ever seen. Just, again, you don't need to be cosplay doesn't need to be 100% screen accurate to look impressive, and like this stuff like just looked cool, and just the fact that there's a bunch of high school kids putting together stuff out of cardboard and whatever they could, like, plastic, whatever they could find, was just all the more impressive. And that was a cool build.
Awesome. Yeah, I remember hearing about that play. I was very jealous that I didn't get to see a high school production of Alien. Maybe I'll get the kids pushed into that when they get to high school. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us. This has been really, really wonderful, and exactly as good as I hoped it would be. So thanks.
Yeah, I feel like we could talk about this for all night long if we did.
Yeah,
we
could.
Thank you for having me.
I've definitely got another hour in me, but
we can do a part 2 at some point.
There you go.
We'll do it live over beers.